Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 7. We're back. Well, we're almost back. Unfortunately, Paul can't be with us today, but he will be with us for our next regular episode when we'll be discussing Conan Doyle's despicable pirate captain, the fiendish Sharky. In the meantime, I'm pleased to bring you the first of our interview shows, in which we'll be speaking to special guests about different aspects of Conan Doyle's life and work and things happening in the Doylean world. First up, it's Conan Doyle and Sport, and I was delighted to speak earlier today to the co-editor of Canadian Holmes, Mark Albertstat. Mark Alberstat is a Sherlockian living in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and a member of the Baker Street Irregulars with the investiture, appropriately enough, of Halifax. His Sherlockian journey began in the 1980s when he formed a Scion Society, which is still going today. In 2011, with his wife Joanne, he became co-editor of Canadian Holmes, the journal of the Bootmakers of Toronto. When he isn't compiling the next edition of the journal, he can be found researching and writing his favourite topic, Conan Doyle and Sport, which we'll be delving into today. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Always happy to talk about Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle, sports, whatever you want to talk.
Brilliant. Well, we'll get through all of those, I think. But before we get started, tell us how you came to be involved in the Sherlockian and Doylean world.
It started, of course, with where I'm 55 now, so I didn't start with Sherlock or the Brett series. I started reading from my father's Doubleday set and enjoyed the stories. And then a few years later, I found a used version of DeWall's World Bibliography of Sherlock Holmes. And when I was flipping through it, I found a listing of all these Sherlock Holmes societies around the world. And of course, I found the one in Toronto. Of course, I looked frequently for locals or close people and joined them. And they have a journal that you mentioned, Canadian Holmes. And when I found that list of clubs, I started writing to them basically in the order that they were listed. And early on, I came across the Brothers Three Moriarty because it was alphabetical. When I wrote to them, a man by the name of John Bennett Shaw wrote back, who is now, we all know, kind of the Johnny Appleseed of American Sherlockians. He would encourage people, incredibly so. And he and I had correspondence for years. And every couple months, every few months, he would send me a package in the mail, and it would be a manila envelope just stuffed full of extra clippings that he's received, because he would have stuff from all over the world coming into him, and he'd take some extras or doubles or triplicates that he had and put them in an envelope, put a little note in it with me, and send it to me. And through our correspondence, he knew I was a sports fan. My father was a sports fan, grew up watching sports. John knew it. And one of the things he encouraged me to do was start my own local club, which he was famous for, and I did. And the club's still going today. I started as a teenager, and years and years, decades later, still going. We're called the Spence Monroes after Colonel Spence Monroe from the stories, who is said to have moved to Halifax. So we couldn't pass by such an obvious reference. And one of the things that John sent me one day was a pullout of a Sports Illustrated article from 1963, so before I was born even. It was Baring Gould's article, Sherlock Holmes Sportsman,
Ah.
from Sports Illustrated. And he said, "You like sports, you might find this interesting." And he encouraged me to research and write on that topic. Later, I was a sports writer for a daily newspaper for a little while, and my wife was a big sports fan, and she was a writer for another daily newspaper for years. So writing about sports came natural, and why not look at Sherlock Holmes and sports and Conan Doyle and sports? And when you start scratching that surface, you can find it's a fairly deep vein that really hasn't been mined at all, or very little. Conan Doyle was involved in sports almost a couple times a week
Yeah.
for his entire life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Every weekend he was playing for one cricket team or another. When he was starting out his medical practice, he was a goalie in what I'd call soccer.
Yeah.
And he played under A.C. Smith
Yes.
because it wasn't the sport that you'd want your doctor playing in those days.
Yeah.
And I think that speaks some of it to
Yeah.
his interest in sports. When he was building his own homes, he built a billiards room,
Yeah.
and he was a very good billiards player as well.
Yeah, it's amazing how much of a part sports play in his life and work. I was lucky enough to look at some of his notebooks in the British Library recently, and I was struck by the fact that at the end of each year he keeps a tab of three things: what he wrote that year, what he earned, and his cricket scores.
I'm not surprised. He was a very, very good cricketer, and he played for decades. When he finished Hodder and went on to Stonyhurst, they played Stonyhurst cricket. Just by calling it that, you know it's not your average cricket.
Yeah.
This is not cricket, as they would say. It was its own kind of brand of cricket, and the lower end of the bat was kind of oval shaped, so it wasn't kind of like the cricket bat you'd think now.
Yeah.
It was curved and concave on the striking side.
That's almost like a scoop.
Exactly, yeah. And the bowling was also strange in Stonyhurst, where it was all underarm,
Yeah.
and of course, and they were basically rolling it along the ground, and which of course wouldn't be allowed today. But in this super odd, leave it to Stonyhurst, that's how they played. Now, unfortunately, Doyle didn't play a lot of Stonyhurst cricket. Kind of during his second year there, they brought in what they called London cricket. So it's a little more traditional cricket. Unfortunately, he didn't get to play on the first 11 for Stonyhurst. He was certainly getting better, as if you look back in the Stonyhurst archives. You can find him, and he was getting better as the time went on, but he never quite cracked the top league there. No. But it did set him up for not quite a lifetime, but decades more of cricket.
And he played for the school alumni, I think. The Wanderers, was it?
The Wanderers, yeah. Which is a funny name, because they would often play sometimes the school team, and he played on a lot of teams. There was teams that he'd play on just for a weekend, and actually his honeymoon was his first honeymoon was based around a cricket trip to Ireland.
That's some serious commitment to cricket.
Well, and his wife's commitment as well. We
Yeah.
don't, I don't know if we have her diary for the honeymoon. Maybe it's best that we don't. And that was with the Wanderers, that honeymoon. And then, of course, he also played with the Alaka Berries, the super strange team that J.M. Barrie created. J.M. Barrie, of course, being the author of Peter Pan and other books. And basically it was made up of some of the best literary names at the time,
Yeah.
although far not the best cricketers.
No, it doesn't sound like it. Actually, Alexis Barquin at the Conan Doyle Encyclopedia has just produced a brilliant infographic that provides an overview of Conan Doyle's entire cricketing career and reveals just how much cricket he played.
Well, when he was interviewed at one point early on, he had just moved into a new house, and he said one of the reasons he liked that location was because there was a cricket pitch, basically across the road. Some of us might say, "Oh, we really like the grounds, or the backyard is big enough for the family." For him, he said, "Oh, yeah, there's a cricket pitch across the road." I don't know if that was the only reason he bought this house, but it was a consideration. And I'm sure if you talk to anybody else on that J.M. Barrie team, Kipling or Wells or P.G. Woodhouse or Jerome K. Jerome, they wouldn't even know where the closest cricket pitch was.
No,
Most
no.
of them. And there he is buying a place near a cricket pitch. And of course he did play against the Doctor, Grace,
Oh, yeah.
and that was certainly a big thrill for him.
Absolutely. And he wrote a poem about it, a reminiscence of cricket, in 1922, the opening lines of which are, "Once in my heyday of cricket, a day I will ever recall, I captured that glorious wicket, the greatest, the grandest of all." So even by 1922, he'd been dining out on the event for 20 years. I mean, it was clearly a great moment for him.
I'm sure it was. It would be, pitching to Babe Ruth or skating with Wayne Gretzky. Although Grace was 12, 15 years older than him at the
Yeah.
time. And Grace wasn't in his prime, although Doyle may have been. So I'm not sure it was a fair matchup, but even at that, Grace was still a dominant force.
Yeah.
And when anybody in cricket had to face him, you'd face the history, you'd face the legend.
And yet cricket doesn't really appear in his fiction. There's the story of Spedigue's or Spedigue's dropper in the 1920s, but otherwise only a few references here and there.
Cricket really isn't mentioned very much at all in the Sherlock Holmes stories. And one of my little pet theories is that every time he wrote Baker Street, he may have thought of Lord's Cricket Ground.
Yes.
The original manuscript or notes for A Study in Scarlet says that the location was going to be Upper Baker Street when Baker Street had such a designation. And that upper end is very close to Lord's Cricket Ground. And if you were a cricket-loving English person and you look at a map of London and you're thinking, where am I going to place my character? You're going to look just at Lord's Cricket Ground. It's it's just one of those things you'd naturally your eye would go to, and what is right there but Baker Street?
Yes, I think you're onto something there. I wonder what your take is on the oft-quoted theory that Conan Doyle hit on the name Sherlock by combining the names of two Nottinghamshire cricketers, Sherwin and Shacklock, the latter of whom had a brother called Mycroft.
Yeah, well, we all like to try to find the origin of any of the stories and the names. Some of the names are rather odd. The thought that he put together the two cricketers For the name of Sherlock, I think it's as good as any, and where it brings in his love of cricket, I think it's better than some.
Another sport that gets referenced a fair few times in Conan Doyle's fiction and in the Sherlock Holmes stories in particular is rugby, but it's a sport you don't think he played.
He doesn't seem to have. There's not a lot of evidence. Certainly, there's a lot of evidence for other sports, boxing, as we mentioned, cricket. He even tried his hand at baseball, but rugby, oddly enough, isn't. And if you think of Conan Doyle and his size, he looks like a solid rugby player.
He does.
You know, you wouldn't want to try to tackle him high up, that's for sure. Take him off at the knees or something to slow him down if he was running down the field. But you know, he did state, I'm not sure where it was. He thought boxing was the finest single man sport, and he thought rugby was the best collective sport. Of course, the Sherlock Holmes story, The Missing Three Quarters, is based around a rugby player who was a very, very good rugby player too, not run of the mill, somebody who played a little at Cambridge. He played for Blackheath. He played for 5 internationals. So if you're playing at that rank, you're a good player. And Godfrey Staunton, the player in question, was such an outstanding person.
Yes.
And I think there's a bit of Doyle in Godfrey Staunton, you know, and at the same time, Watson was said to have been a good rugby player in The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire, and he also played for Blackheath. Watson as a rugby player, yeah, we'll take it.
Yes, I think so. And Conan Doyle's other great narrator, Edward Malone, in The Lost World and other novels, he's a rugby international, and there's an implicit connection made between strength of character and moral fortitude and manliness that is signified by both Watson and Malone being rugby players. And Roxton describes rugby as the manliest game we have left, as though all the manly sports are disappearing.
Very much so, and of course, Lord John Roxton recognized Malone when they first met. He said, "Oh no, not the Malone who played for I think played against Ireland for England, or maybe for Ireland.
For Ireland.
For Ireland, and I think if now you might remember, isn't that the one where he says he had his cap?
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah, so he played well. And yeah, just one more narrator who's playing rugby. And while Conan Doyle doesn't seem to have played very much, but he obviously enjoyed it enough to see some of his more manly characters in this. And Conan Doyle does see sports as part of the British identity. One thing we haven't touched on is Conan Doyle's involvement in the Olympics. I've just been doing some research in the past few weeks for an article for Canadian Holmes on Conan Doyle and the 1912 to 1916 stretch for the Olympics. The previous Olympics was in London. England did very well. They were at the top of the podium, top of all the lists. And then the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm, England did terribly. The Americans came on strong, and of course the host country did well, as they usually do when they're hosts. Before the Olympics were even over, there were press articles saying, just pulling their hair out, that you know the once proud and strong and capable British athlete can't do anything at the Olympics anymore. And Conan Doyle took up the struggle as he picked up his pen and wrote letters to the editor as he was wont to, and Lord Northcliffe, who was the newspaper magnate, and he encouraged Conan Doyle to set up an executive committee, kind of parallel to the true British Olympic Committee, to raise funds and hire some good coaches and prepare a team for the next Olympics. And he did form a committee. He thought £10,000 would be sufficient to at least get them started. And it was going to be a public appeal because he wanted the British public behind this.
Yes.
And he was away on a trip, and the committee met, and they had agreed to £10,000 previous. He's away. Then all of a sudden he's seeing all this newspaper reports that the committee has asked for £100,000 from from the public, which was a huge sum.
Massive.
In 1912, 1913. And there was a lot of backlash, and eventually they only raised 7. So far short of their 100,000 and even short of their original amount. But part of the reason it fell short was there was such a backlash when the committee asked for 100,000.
Oh yeah, I can imagine.
And they also didn't. They said it smacked of professionalism, and that was the last thing the British wanted their sports men and women to be as professionals, opposed to a lot of the Americans and other countries who had sports specialists. The British team that was sent to Stockholm, there'd be some rugby players, and they'd say, "Oh, you're a rugby player. You're good at running. You'll go in. You'll go in some of the field events, and you're a good size. You can throw the discus." So, opposed to some of the other teams who had real specialists,
Yeah,
and that made the difference. And some of the press said, "Well, if we're going to be professionals, we don't want any part of it."
it's really interesting you bring out the point about professionalism, because Conan Doyle often wrote about the virtues of amateur sport. He seems innately opposed to the idea that the team with the biggest purse gets the best players, which, aside from issues of fairness, also undermined the connection between sport and place, which he writes about. The idea that you play for your local side. Of course, Sherlock Holmes describes amateur sport as the best and finest thing in England.
He does describe it that way, and absolutely. I had interviewed Dame Jean Conan Doyle years ago, and I had written to her earlier and said I wanted to talk to her about her father and sports. And the letter I got back was, "Sure, I'm willing to talk about that topic." And I forget the exact phrase she used, but it was clear that if I had written her and said, "I want to talk about Sherlock Holmes,"
Yeah.
she may have been busy that day. So she set up a time, and we had a lovely conversation about her father and sports. She would remember, the very long skis that were in the house, that was cluttering up the house, and cricket bats and stuff around the house. But one thing she wanted me to know and wanted me to make clear is that her father was proud of being an all-rounder. He wasn't a specialist in any one sport. We see him as being very good at cricket, and he played a lot of cricket, so he did become very good. But he put his hand at so much that she wanted us to remember him as a good all-rounder. And of course, if you're a good all-rounder, you're far from a professional.
And it's wonderful to have the perspective of Dame Jean. Did she remember anything about her father and cycling, I wonder? Because he didn't cycle competitively, but he was a very keen cyclist.
He was. She didn't mention it, but he was certainly an avid cyclist. There's no question there. And of course, he wrote it into some of his fiction. In 1892, in a Strand magazine, obviously 1892, Conan Doyle is just starting to hit his stride as a writer. The Strand sent Harry Howe to the Doyles' new home to do a profile of their latest literary lion. And one of the pictures that goes along with it is a picture of Conan Doyle and his wife Louisa on a tandem tricycle. But it shows when a photographer showed up and said, we're doing a profile of you, he got into his cycling duds and says, "Take a picture of us on our new tricycle." Yeah. And that speaks to it. And then of course he wrote it into several stories as well, and of course the Adventure of the Priory School, where there's bicyclists, and the Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist. And the big cycling craze was on at the time, and there's no question he was an avid cycler. He wrote to his mother that he had done a 30-mile round trip, and he wrote in 1896. When the spirits are low, when the day appears dark, when work becomes monotonous, when hope hardly seems worth having, just mount a bicycle and go for a spin down the road.
Yes, and that speaks to his interest in sport for physical and mental well-being. And it's notable, I think, that around the time of the Olympic Committee you mentioned, Conan Doyle was preoccupied with thoughts of the empire and wrote a fair bit about boys' education and sports as a way of reversing what he perceived to be a decline in fortunes.
And sadly, it wasn't. It continued, but he does see sports as part of Britain. He saw sports as being part of the ideal person.
Yeah.
And he also worked out. He had a fitness regimen with Eugene Sandow, who was a well-known Victorian, and he had a gym. And Conan Doyle was a member. The two of them knew each other. In fact, Conan Doyle wrote a preface or an introduction to Sandow's book. It shows that it wasn't just a sport; it was all sports, and it was for physical culture and its own mental well-being. He was working out with dumbbells. He was on the cricket pitch. He was skiing before skiing was active. It was also something he invested in, of course, too. When he invested in the auto wheel, the auto wheel basically turned your pedal bike into some kind of very loud motorcycle, early motorcycle. This was about 1909 when he invested. He was a third or two-thirds owner of this company that built the auto wheel, and they built thousands of them. Unfortunately, within 10 years, the company was bankrupt and Conan Doyle had lost his money. Yeah. As he seems to have done often with his investments. He was a very talented writer, but a terrible investor. And the auto wheel is an odd little sidecar, so to speak, of his interest in sports. And there are still auto wheels around. If you go on YouTube and search it out, you'll see people have found these rusted old auto wheels and have them running up and down the country lanes.
Yeah, the auto wheel. It's a slightly odd investment. As you know, if he'd invested in anything, you kind of think it would have been the automobile because he had such a love of cars.
He certainly did. He was a wealthy man, no question, and he was an early advocate of automobiles in England. His groom, because he had horses too, was first trained to drive a car, and they went and got the car that he first bought, his first car. And instead of having the groom drive it home, who was trained, Conan Doyle thought, I'll drive it home. So there was, I'm sure it was a loud, nerve-wracking trip home. His sons certainly picked up that, and they raced cars, all kinds of cars, for many years. And no question, they got the love of competition, the love of sports, and the money from their father. And there was one point where we almost lost our favorite author when he was coming back from a golf match. For whatever reason, the car got out of control, and it turned over, and his passenger was able to get out, but it pinned him upside down. The car was upside down, and it was across his back. So he could have very easily had a very, very serious injury. Enough people came over, they heard the crash, and they were able to pull it off him. At one point, he attributes his ability to survive that crash and to basically hold an early car on his back to his work with Sandow and his strength training. So it all comes around to the man himself and his love of physical fitness may have saved him and may have given us, Conan Doyle, and all of his writing some more years.
And he fictionalized that incident, didn't he, in a story called How It Happened?
How It Happened, exactly. Yeah, he did fictionalize it. The outcome was certainly different.
Yeah.
At the end of How It Happened, he's standing there looking at the crash, and he realized that he is a spirit, and he didn't quite make it out the way it truly happened. But it was all good because it was during his spiritualism time, and it's a fun story. A lot of Conan Doyle's other works are fun to read. It also reminds us that he wrote so much more, and his love of sports does show up in other writings. One of the cars that his sons owned for a while was the original Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which was a very famous car and still is if you know of the movies and whatnot. But that also speaks to the kind of money they had, and they would own and resell and race and resell other cars, and that was one of the cars they owned. Every once in a while, one of their very fancy cars, will come up for auction, and it'll often mention that the Conan Doyle brothers owned this or that car for. It was usually a fairly short time. They didn't keep any of their cars very long. I don't think either of their wives were very happy with them racing the cars for obvious just safety reasons, and they didn't race a lot, and they weren't particularly good at it either. I just don't think they were great drivers. There were some talented drivers at the time that they would be against, and these guys had the money in the cars.
Absolutely.
But it takes more than that.
Absolutely. And their experience of racing was a far cry from Conan Doyle's own experience of car racing. Back in episode 4, we touched on the Prince Henry Tour, which was an altogether more sedate affair.
Yeah, the Prince Henry Tour is an interesting little sidelight of Conan Doyle and the automobile. And he didn't win that race either, but he did all right.
And he took his wife with him, I think.
He did. There was I believe three people in the car. There was always a British person and a German person, and if Conan Doyle was driving, the German was the basically from the other side.
Yes.
Making sure they went all on the right routes and kept it all above board. And each team was like that. And I believe you're right. His wife was with them. And it was a time when he was wealthy, he was well known, he could do that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why not?
In fact, Marcus Geiser got in touch with us after episode 4 to point out that Conan Doyle's opponent in that race, Graf Karma, was a likely model for von Bork in His Last Bow. A sport that you mentioned right at the beginning that I'd like to loop back to now as we near the end of the podcast is baseball, because I didn't think Conan Doyle had any particular connection to baseball, but you've uncovered quite a lot.
That was a surprise to a lot of people. I wrote about it in the Baker Street Journal in 2016, and of course it was in the summer edition, which was the appropriate edition for them to put it in. When I started researching it, I thought, it'd be a short article, let's face it. And then I found a lot of information. And Conan Doyle really enjoyed baseball. Now, I'm a happy Canadian to be able to say that one of the few times that Conan Doyle actually stood up, went to bat, was in Canada.
Yeah.
It was in 1914 in Jasper, Alberta. and they obviously knew that the famous author Conan Doyle was there, and they were having a baseball match between a couple local teams, and they asked Conan Doyle if he would come in and hit the initial pitch. So he wrote that the pitcher fortunately was merciful, and and the ball came in swift but true. I steadied myself by trying to imagine that it was a cricket bat, which I held in my grasp, and that it was a full toss, which asked me to be hit over the ropes. Fortunately, I got it fairly in the middle, and it went on its pointed way, whizzing past the ear of a photographer who expected me just to pat it in. I should not care to have to duplicate that performance. So again, he had never picked up a baseball bat that we knew of, and yet they asked him, why not? He did make a few trips to North America, of course, and in 1923, Conan Doyle was in Canada on Canada Day, and he witnessed an international baseball match between Winnipeg and Minneapolis in the morning. He was also in New York in 1914, so a fair bit before this Canada Day match or Dominion Day, and he goes to the Polo Grounds, which in New York is the famous baseball field, and he takes in a game and enjoys it immensely. He wrote about baseball a fair bit, and he says, baseball is a novel game. I enjoy watching it immensely. I know baseball is the game England needs. For years, there has been a demand for a young man's game, and baseball will fit the want.
That's amazing, isn't it?
You wouldn't think he would be so fond of baseball. He loved all sports, but to think that this is the game that England needs.
And he did write to the British newspapers suggesting that there should be a professional association to promote baseball in the UK. But the thing that I was amazed by in your article, because I'd never have put these words in Conan Doyle's mouth, was something he wrote in 1922 or 23, and he said, I have all the prejudices of an old cricketer, and yet I cannot get away from the fact that baseball is the better game.
Indeed, he wrote that in his book, Our Second American Adventure, basically is one of his memoirs. And he writes, it's on the page, it's recorded. One of the reasons I think he preferred it is because it's done and dusted within a couple hours.
Absolutely.
He also found that the outfielders in baseball were as good or better than a lot of the people in the field for cricket. He was amazed at how good they were in the field and how strong they were in and accurate they were in throwing the ball in from the outfield. He enjoyed it, plain and simple. He thought it was a good game. He did think baseball would catch on in England, and unfortunately, as we all know today, there are baseball teams in England, but I think he'd be disappointed.
Yeah, I think so.
Thankfully he didn't invest in it like he did the auto wheel, but I think he'd still be disappointed just as much.
Brilliant. So we've covered a huge amount of ground here and only really scratched the surface. So what's next for you? I mean, we haven't really talked about soccer or skiing, boxing, billiards, golf.
Ballooning?
Ballooning.
You went up in a balloon once. I guess that's considered a pastime more than a sport. And his involvement with Sandow that I mentioned, Eugene Sandow. I've started to look into that a little more. There's definitely some very good biographies about him. And Conan Doyle is almost always mentioned as one of the proponents of the Sandow method. And I think all the Sherlockians listening to this podcast enjoy the writings, but they also enjoy knowing about the author himself. And you can read the various biographies, and there's plenty of them. And there's some very good ones, of course, too. All the biographies touch on his love of sports, but they don't really look at Conan Doyle sportsman.
No.
And this is a small, very small little aspect of our love for all things Sherlockian that I've found that if you really want to know about Conan Doyle, you have to understand that he was a great athlete and a great all-rounder, as Dame Jean wanted us to remind everybody that he tried everything. He was an all-rounder. He was a great athlete and an all-rounder.
Well, I think that's a great point to end us on. So it only remains for me to thank you, Mark, for coming on the podcast and sharing with us your passion and enthusiasm for Conan Doyle in sport. I think it gives a great insight into the person behind the pen, as it were. So thanks very much for coming on the podcast. I'm sure we're all eager to read your next article on the subject.
Well, thanks. It's been fun. I hope our listeners enjoy Conan Doyle in sports and can do some back research into my previous articles and look forward to new ones. There's lots more to be written on this subject.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thanks for your time. Thanks for your listening.
So that wraps up this interview episode. We hope you enjoyed this interlude. Paul and I will be back as soon as we can reconvene in the studio. So until then, it's goodbye from me and stay safe and well. Goodbye.